Excellent, thank you. So I'd like to thank the previous speakers. They've actually perhaps made it a bit easier for me to go through my presentation. There's been some discussion around the science, the strategy, technology, as well as CROs. And so what I'd like to do in these next 30 minutes is just basically touch upon some of the challenges that smaller biotechs do have in the fact that they would like to be as successful as large pharma. And as our previous speaker, Tina, just mentioned, sometimes it's not as easy to align with the larger CROs and move forward the programs. This is just a slide on the traditional disclaimer. These are points of consideration that I am presenting as my own and not that of Xentria or Mihal. I wanted to start with something that perhaps a number of the attendees may have either participated in or seen in the past. And this was a benchmarking survey that was done just a little less than 2 years ago, where there was a key question around what if an organization was likely to change the CROs that they currently had been operating with, and would they do so in the next few years. Now, granted, this is pre-COVID, but it was interesting to see that it is basically a 70-30 type of split, where 70% of the persons and organizations that participated in the survey basically said, not really likely, and 30% were saying, well, we just might do that. So how does that fit together with what we know in the industry? We know that right now there are the same, as usual, involved in driving what is occurring in drug development. They may switch positions year on year, but usually they're all the same ones that we have seen over the last 5 or so, 10 years, even with all of the mergers and acquisitions that have taken place. When we look at the top CROs, very similarly, in the last 5 to 10 years, we see some of the same names. I believe Tina even brought up one, and there was a question or a comment from one of the participants. So why bring these up? Why bring up the top 10 pharma and the top 10 CRO? There's a very key reason. They drive the industry standards. They are driving how we operate. They drive the definitions of success and partnerships. So when you look at how these particular top 10s in each of the categories are situated, they have really driven the preferred provider approach. It can be referred to as a strategic alliance. It might be founded on very strong therapeutic area alignments and the science behind it. It might be buried within the integrated platform and portfolios. And certainly it defines whether the work that is done is full service or functional. And by that, the difference might be where the large pharmas may have certain aspects of what we need to develop our programs, such as data management or biostats, may be fully in-house. Tina mentioned the clinical monitoring, but other elements involved are actually that which are outsourced by these companies, and so it's a specific function. So when you are a smaller company coming to the table, and these are particularly well-grounded approaches, it becomes very challenging to make sure that what a smaller company needs and how a smaller company is set up can actually move forward in a successful manner. And I bring this slide forward not endorsing any particular CRO at all, but just to basically say there are similar differences. What one may highlight in one area, another may highlight some other aspect. And if you walk into any particular project team meeting and you are in the process of discussing who we should be contracting or as the CRO for a given program or studies, and perhaps even who should we be thinking about in longer term operations, I would venture to guess that at least half of these names that you see on this slide will pop up. The reason I have highlighted some is because there are some key manners in which these CROs are beginning to work more closely with some of the biotech companies. And just to give you an example, PPD is very much focusing on, perhaps with a smaller biotech company, driving home bioanalytical and early development, as well as perhaps the later stage life cycle management. IQVIA drives home that they now have very focused part of their business on biotech, and also the ability to leverage quite a bit of what has come together between Quintiles and IMS Holdings having joined, and what you have perhaps not too infrequently is the discussion around how they can help a smaller company that doesn't have a lot of internal data or a lot of studies look at real world evidence. Syneos, for example, in fact, I think I heard one of our previous speakers talk about a special project that was put together with Syneos. They also have the capability to talk about how they can link the drug development steps to the commercial planning. So eventually all of them can bring anything and everything to the table, so it becomes the more difficult to try and decide who can a smaller company feel most comfortable with and really achieve the success with all the planning that is needed to move forward. The business model is usually choosing from a list of preferred providers. A smaller company that is now embarking in drug development may not necessarily have that. So you may need to choose, perhaps one of the other steps is to choose a new provider that isn't on a preferred providers list. And how is that done? Usually someone at the table as part of the team recognizes, has experience, or will say, I know that they can do this because they did this previously. That can be a good thing. It can have its own issues on itself. And then basically for the majority of smaller biotech companies, they are choosing from a new unknown provider. So the choices are large to mid-sized CROs, niche CROs, Tina brought our attention to that, and really thinking about the service needs that a smaller company may have. Here we're talking about companies that can be as small as an N of 3 to maybe an N of 100 people that run the gamut of different responsibilities for that biotech company. The scope of work definition becomes really important when you're talking about things from a manufacturing standpoint, when you're talking about things from perhaps some bench work. It may be much easier to define it than when you are talking about putting the full clinical development plans together. Helping the organization understand the difference between units and hours, what change orders will be, because they will come, whether it's 1 or whether it's 10, at some point in the course of developing a particular drug, there will be numerous change orders that come from the CROs. So how does the organization feel about that? Do they understand that? Are they prepared as a small company? Whereas in a larger pharma, it's just expected. You set a threshold, everyone agrees, and you move forward. But I want to focus a little bit more on this, what business needs need to be met. In a smaller organization, the stronger the therapeutic area experience is, the easier it becomes to really select a particular CRO. Knowing if you need functional service or full service becomes very important. And I'll bring up one other element, because we've been talking about, I've heard some of our speakers talk about integrated technologies and platforms. Many of the smaller biotech companies will have very little in-house. So it becomes really important to be thinking about what can they use short-term, what will they need long-term, and what is the commitment and strategy for that biotech company to really bring the platforms in-house. And one other element that does actually help with a smaller biotech company is that the larger CROs actually oftentimes can bring to the table some favorable specialty vendor agreements. Maybe it's a vendor related to cardiovascular assessments. Maybe it is a special lab or some sort of special biomarkers. We've been hearing about that today. The ability of these CROs to say, look, we have worked with and we have an agreement, so perhaps that will help you as a smaller company move forward. So we know that the larger companies have a tremendous amount of revenue, those top 10 as I showed you, as well as the top 10 CRO. Why the biotechs? I wanted to put some things in context for you. Worldwide, the biotech drug sales in the last several years have come up close to $300 billion, US dollars. There's a tremendous amount of funding. I know that there are many companies that feel and wish that the funding was greater, but it is at this time roughly around $50 billion. And when you are thinking about, excuse me, the IPO values of a number of biotechs in Europe and US, you're looking at over $6 billion. So this is not small change when you look at investment. So I'm going to pull you back one more step and bring to the attention the number of privately held biotechs that are currently out there. There are more than 700 worldwide, and between them they are working on some overlapping, but 1,000+ diseases or deliveries for very particular therapeutics or different technologies, or focusing on unmet clinical needs. That's quite a bit. And yes, the larger pharma companies continue to put anywhere from $8 to $10 billion back into R&D. But when you look at these biotech companies, even if it is a small amount from each one of them, there's a tremendous amount of investment in the biotech world. Some of them really are single asset focused. Some are really looking at particular therapeutic areas and may have several related assets that they are trying to develop. But they also have a varied experience, varied experience in the C-suite. Not all of them have a C-suite of retired executives from Merck or Novartis or Pfizer. You are talking about C-suites with varied experience and background, some of which have no experience in the drug development arena. but they have an idea, they have a concept, and they have the funds to go forward. So it becomes very important to realize that there is a strategy and there's a foundation behind it. And not all of them simply open up the door as a biotech company because they have an exit strategy. It is very challenging when a CRO comes to the table and in their minds, all you want is to do phase 1 or phase 2, and then you're going to license out that asset, or you're hoping that one of the big 10 will come and acquire the company. Not all of them have that. So why am I bringing this up? Because it's as important for the CRO to understand the setup, the background, and the foundation of these smaller biotechs as well as they understand the Big 10. So I'm going to show you something that over the last 20 years has really been evolving. If you were to look now at the top 25 or so biotech companies, go back and look at their history. They certainly didn't come out of the door with this kind of value behind them, but they were determined to be successful. They found ways to operate and leverage what they needed internally as core competencies, what they needed to hire and bring to the table, and how they worked with the CROs in order to have successful, safe, and effective products out the door. And the 700 or so, those particular numbers of biotechs in the background, even if you have a number of them that are operating on an exit strategy approach, a number of them want to break into this group here. And so that needs to be remembered as the two parties come to the table. So when I look at what is similar or different between biotech and large pharma, let's talk about first the shared objective. It doesn't matter. A large company or a small company is looking to be successful with their product or their new molecules, and to be sure that whichever regulatory agency they are actually putting the dossier forward with, that the data shows it is safe, it is efficacious, it is approvable, and it is marketable. That is basically the common thread across the large and the small pharma. So then you come back and you say, okay, so there's a difference in experience, there is a difference in size, there is a difference in funding. But when I look at the business models, you might say, okay, then it's different, but they really aren't. You may find that there are some small biotech companies that decide, you know what, we're going to keep as much as we can in-house and really only outsource a specific part of the drug development. And maybe they may decide it will only be the clinical monitoring, and they will take the time to build their own database. They will take the time to bring the technologies in-house. So the business model needs to be clearly understood. Other companies, when they are small, an N of 3, 5, 10, almost everything will need to be outsourced. Most biotech companies sit in the hybrid model approach. There's a level of core competencies and roles they will have in-house, and then there are certain aspects that they must outsource. And so the CRO that comes to the table to work with these companies really needs to understand this difference. And also from their own experience, needs to talk to the sponsor around what will or will not work. It isn't just about getting that contract signed and running ahead. It's equally important to assure that assumptions that need to be corrected around the business model are brought to the table. and then how to get that work done and done well with quality, data integrity in order to achieve that objective we just mentioned at the top of the slide really becomes feasible because there is that kind of partnership. So in essence, what I've been trying to drive home is that one size does not fit all. Whether you talk the top 10 or whether you're talking smaller biotechs with a large or a niche CRO. Experience from both sides needs to be understood. The resourcing needs to be clear. Does the biotech company have all the staff it needs? If it does not, because it is really a smaller company, then the CRO needs to understand the depth of the staffing support that they need to bring to the table, and certainly not someone who is just coming into drug development and perhaps this is the first time they are working on a phase 3 study. That does not help the relationship and the confidence that a smaller biotech company will have with a CRO. The funds become important. Sponsors need to be very straightforward on what is or is not possible, and the technology balance. I recently had a communication with someone on the finance side of things, and I have to say it was extremely refreshing to hear this person say, I know every time we are speaking with one of these CROs, it can be just a little bit frustrating on both sides of the table. Yes, biotech companies can at times be a bit needy. Why? Because they are breaking into an area they haven't been before, because they know that it is important to succeed. There isn't that depth and breadth of portfolio and revenue that many of those other companies have. So that planning we were just hearing about really becomes quite critical. I wanted to just sort of summarize then some of the elements that when business development and the project managers from respective CROs are sitting with the smaller biotech companies need to be sure that all of these cards are brought forward. The therapeutic expertise. If this is a biotech company that really has some very novel asset, and they are trying to see where it fits in that therapy area and how it fits against the competitors and what is already out there. It becomes very important for the CRO to acknowledge they do have the experience or they do not, because the two have to be able to fit together, both the CRO and the biotech company. Leadership at the project team level. While the company may be small, they will be putting some very experienced persons at the head of the table. And it is important to have, from the CRO side, experienced leadership at the project team level as well. We've heard many times that the success of an organization, a project, a program, is about the team. It's no different here. To have the qualified functional expertise. It's not unusual for a smaller biotech company not to have a biometrics group. So to bring data management and seasoned statisticians to help them refine the protocols is very much needed. Preferred providers, if it's a smaller biotech company and they really don't have that, to hear from the CRO that here are some of the key providers that we can help you work with and actually achieve the relationship to succeed on these studies is quite important. The willingness to commit on both sides of the table is critical. On the biotech side, it is not unusual to have one person wear several hats. They roll up their sleeve and they do that work. There has to be a willingness for a CRO to also commit to support that, to understand that, and to bring the counterparts. In the CRO's case, it may be 3 people who come to the table to work together. And I won't stress lightly here. I want to drive this home, the willingness to negotiate. This is unlike those strategic alliance and partnerships I mentioned when I talked about the top 10, whether pharma or CRO. With a smaller company, a CRO needs to also be willing to have skin in the game, to take on some risk, and to willingly negotiate on elements of planning and cost and timing. Together, that then allows all of these pieces collectively to be looked at as, we know what we're responsible and accountable for, you are taking on accountability as well, and the project can move forward. So what's important again then for a smaller biotech or pharma company? You need to be knowing that they have to focus on identifying what they need as part of a best development model. Do they have clinical pharmacology, clinical science and clinical affairs, biometrics, clinical operations, medical writing, project management? Not, again, to be ignored because it plays such an important role. If the biotech company doesn't have all of these pieces, then having that CRO say, we can support A, B, C, D, and E. To go on around the principles of quality and regulatory compliance and technical aspects. Do we need to bring on other vendors? Do we need to bring on consultants? Can the CRO provide all of these pieces? That becomes important at the end of the day. The dossier submitted belongs to the biotech company. And so making sure that we are having a CRO work together with the biotech company to ensure all of these things at the highest level of competency as well as completeness becomes important. That also then allows a biotech company to begin to learn and to reapply. Certainly, as Tina mentioned just previous to my presentation, you cannot just take one plan and run it across. But there will be those learnings that then allow the biotech company to set a best path forward, selecting the vendors, beginning to have vendor oversight and management responsibilities that support the clinical development plans ahead. Really works into how a CRO can best be selected because you bring these principles and points of consideration forward as you are working with a smaller biotech company. And that in turn brings the opportunity to be successful in perhaps future collaborations. May not be that same volume that the strategic alliance companies have, but it certainly will allow perhaps for one additional or two additional companies to go forward. So I want to then just go on to one additional, let's see, there we go. I'm going to come back to that similar differences. Large or small company, you go to the table requesting RFPs. The selection process may be by a much larger team of people than perhaps just the head of the clinical operations group or the global development project leader, which are roles that the larger pharma companies will go ahead and say, go ahead, you know the process, you get to select. smaller companies may not feel comfortable with that. The other thing is not that they don't just feel comfortable, they are also wanting to learn. There are people around the table in legal, in project management, in finance that are going, okay, we need to understand how these CROs are being selected. To establish, as I mentioned, the best possible agreement in negotiating, being flexible, and that also means bring forward the advantages. I have just one or two additional slides, but I wanted to put this together because there are certainly, again, along the lines of similar differences. I've already mentioned the RFPs, the selection process, but in the contracts, these are pretty large contracts for a smaller company. The skin in the game, I've mentioned, really working through bonus malus approaches, bringing forward the strength of particular experience in those scope of work documents, making sure time, cost, quality are never out of the picture, because we all know that becomes a really, really difficult thing to change down the road. But I'm going to bring one more thing because of where we are right now, the post-COVID challenges. For a smaller biotech company that perhaps has never done the kind of work that you are now embarking upon, it is important to be very transparent and bring up all of these things that now need to be considered that weren't perhaps in their original forecast when a smaller biotech company was thinking about what will it cost to do these studies. Bring the best team members forward. That is important. Bring forward the importance of vendor management. Know the client. At the end of the day, it's about time, quality, and money, and to be successful in outcome. That very last point again, assuring success of the biotech company, assuring success for potential future collaborations, and making sure that we have really brought a therapy forward in whatever manner, shape, or form that is to the benefit of the patient. I'll stop here and see if there's any questions.
Thanks again, Nancy, for your presentation. Very insightful and actually quite practical for a lot of our audience members. And we do have a question for you. And the question is, what do you believe is the greatest hindrance to transparent negotiations on delivery strategy, budget, and performance history between small biotechs and CROs?
That is a really loaded question, but let me let me try giving it a shot. Let me start backwards from the performance history. I truly advise now, over the last 5 or so years, and having moved from large pharma to smaller biotech companies, that when you are thinking about a particular CRO, ask the CRO who they might recommend that you speak with. And I also will tell you, don't take just those recommendations. There are enough people in this industry that you could probably reach out to someone, maybe 1 or 2 companies down the street from you, or even if you were to go into LinkedIn and try and find someone and send them a message, they will tell you. They will be very honest. One thing to keep in mind, no CRO is perfect any more than any other part of businesses. There's strengths and there's weaknesses. As the company, you need to decide what do you need most in order to move forward. On the budget side of things, let me just sort of give you some numbers. I already mentioned that the large pharma companies, it's not unusual to see them put $8 to $10 billion back into R&D, the most expensive being around the cost of the clinical trials, because they have so many trials going on. one needs to remember and not to be quiet about it, but to be able to say, look, when you're telling me that this is only going to cost $1 million, well, $1 million to one of the larger pharma companies translates to 10 or possibly even 100 million and doesn't really move the needle. That $1 million to a smaller biotech company is going to move the needle. So it is important to be very straightforward in saying, we know what it will cost. This is where we know we can go, but we also want to be sure we all deliver. So the CRO needs to be thinking about that, needs to understand that just continuing to put things on the table, A and B and C and D and all the bells and whistles, that is going to drive the cost of the study up so much that if you can turn around and say to them, look, we looked at your clinical trial design, we advise, don't do this or this or this. Let's only have what you absolutely need to be able to show the safety or the efficacy of these compounds. Be willing to make that statement, and as the small biotech company, be willing to say, we know, we've done our homework, and this is what is going to stay in the trial, and we don't need all that other stuff, or we don't want it, because not right now. Maybe down the road, maybe not the phase 2, maybe we'll do it in the phase 3. You have to be able to say that. And on the strategy, you know, from a smaller biotech company side, the strategy may change. And that's got to be important. If at the beginning, the strategy is we are all in, we're going to do this submission on our own, then that's what the CRO needs to hear, and everybody needs to be working together toward that. But if the delivery, that strategy changes, either the CRO may notice something and needs to ask, or the smaller biotech company needs to bring that forward, because that is the only way you might be able to shift the path a bit to stay successful. When the two parties, like in anything, are not transparent, the likelihood of that relationship being successful diminishes. So I hope I've answered that question.
Yeah, hi, this is Jeff. I have a question for you too. Given the fact that many of us have experienced that there's quite a difference among a CRO in terms of the quality of the project team, or particularly the leader, do you have any, particularly since it seems that the smaller companies may have less clout in getting responsiveness and so on, do you have any suggestions for the sponsor in dealing with a leader that isn't what you expected?
So I do believe that there's a part of that is owned by the smaller company. The minute you begin to see it takes too long for their project leader or project manager to be responding, whether to emails or calls or questions, you need to bring that up. So I really advise my team members never lose sight of who that business development person is, because that is your avenue to say, we trusted what you were bringing forward, so we think we have an issue. How do we resolve it? Who do you want us to go to? They will usually respond to that pretty quickly. The other is to actually put within the agreement, might be something like the CRAs, no one with less than 2 to 3 years of experience to be assigned to late stage studies. No one to be assigned who has not worked either with this class of drugs or this type of protocol or in this indication. You need to be specific. That is one of the key things. Knowledge goes a great way in helping the relationship be solid.
That's very helpful. One other question. Can you generalize that in terms of a CRO's willingness to have skin in the game, in other words, pay for performance, bonuses for early delivery, and penalties for timeline slip, is there any generality that the larger versus the smaller or vice versa are willing to entertain those kinds of possibilities?
So, you know, I think it comes, I will tell you what I have seen over the last 3 to 4 years. The CROs are starting to do a little bit more homework on who it is that is asking them for the RFPs. And I have watched some of the larger CROs actually say back to a smaller biotech, no, we don't think we are best suited to either work with you or to provide you what you need. And so it really comes back to the biotech has to lay out, what do we need from you? So some of them are now stepping away, and others will basically at least come back with a list of questions, just like we may have in our RFPs. They will come back and say, well, okay, A, is it just a FDA submission or a global submission? Are you going to do the trials in Europe? Do you have any concerns about going to particular? And so their questions help strengthen the RFPs as well. It's got to be that kind of interactive planning and discussion.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
And then, yeah, as mentioned, if anyone's interested in, hearing more about Nancy's group, I believe, Nancy, your group, Mihal, acquired a new company. Is that correct?
No, we didn't actually acquire a new company. This is out of a relationship between Mihal and their partners, where they were focused primarily on generics, that we actually just several weeks ago opened up, launched, and introduced a biotech company whose focus is biologics and biosimilars, not the generics. So that's Xentria. So it's actually an expansion on the strategy from, I will say, the parent organization.
Okay, wonderful. No, that's good to hear. Now we'll be checking the new company domain later this weekend. So
Excellent.
thanks so much, Nancy. Take care.
Thank you.